Somewhere in northern Europe, around the year 1347, a physician noticed something that did not make sense. The plague had arrived. It was moving through cities at a pace that no one had witnessed before, and no one had language for. Bodies in the streets, entire households silent within a week, and yet, in one guild, among the people who worked most closely with the dying, certain individuals were not dying. Specifically, the men who processed and traded in 4 particular spices were falling sick at dramatically lower rates than the rest of the population. The spice merchants. And the 4 substances they handled every day were cloves, cinnamon, rosemary, and thyme. Nobody understood why, not in any language that would survive examination today. But they had noticed, and noticing was enough. I'm going to tell you what was actually happening inside those men's bodies, the specific molecular mechanisms that modern chemistry has only recently been able to name, and why the 4 compounds at the center of that story connect directly to something the book of Proverbs called, with striking precision, medicine to the bones. But before we get there, I want you to stay with me through a story that begins in a kitchen in 10th century Persia, with a physician who was trying to understand why a simple preparation that had cured people for 500 years suddenly wasn't working. What he discovered, by accident, through frustration, is the single most important piece of practical knowledge in this entire script. Most people who write about these 4 spices never mention it at all. By the end of this, you will know exactly why and exactly what to do differently. This is the problem-solution format, and the problem is older than you think. The problem is not that the plants stopped working. The plants never stopped working. The problem is that we stopped knowing how to open them. Every one of the 4 substances at the center of this script contains antimicrobial compounds that are structurally complex, biologically active, and extraordinarily precise in how they operate. The spice merchants of medieval Europe were not herbalists. They were not healers. They were businessmen, surrounded by product, breathing it daily, absorbing it through their skin and mucous membranes and lungs in constant low doses. Their exposure was not intentional medicine. It was occupational accident. And it was keeping them alive. Let us begin with cloves. Syzygium aromaticum, the dried flower bud of a tree native to the Maluku Islands of Indonesia, what Arab traders called the Islands of Spice, and which every major civilization of the ancient world went to extraordinary lengths to obtain. Roman emperors demanded cloves from India. Chinese physicians of the Han dynasty required officials to chew them before addressing the emperor. For breath, yes, but also because they had observed for centuries that people who chewed cloves regularly suffered fewer of the mouth and throat infections that were, in the ancient world, frequently fatal. Arab physicians in the 9th century documented cloves as a treatment for toothache, for infected gums, for the septic complications of tooth extraction. They were not wrong. They were observing, without the language to explain it, the action of eugenol. Eugenol is a phenylpropanoid compound that makes up between 72 and 90% of clove essential oil. Research from the University of Porto and published in peer-reviewed microbiological journals has demonstrated that eugenol disrupts bacterial cell membrane integrity, not at the surface, but at the phospholipid bilayer itself, the fundamental architectural unit of the bacterial cell wall. The membrane becomes permeable. Internal contents leak out. The bacterium cannot maintain the concentration gradients it requires to function. At sufficient concentrations, eugenol is bactericidal against both gram-positive strains, including Staphylococcus aureus, and gram-negative strains, including Escherichia coli. This is significant because most natural antimicrobial compounds work preferentially against one or the other. Here is what almost no one mentions about eugenol, and this is the first piece of information that changes how you use this spice for the rest of your life. Eugenol's bioavailability, the amount that actually enters your bloodstream and reaches tissue, is dramatically higher when the cloves are freshly ground and consumed with fat. Eugenol is fat-soluble. Whole dried cloves sitting in a spice jar expose you primarily to surface compounds. Ground cloves stirred into warm coconut milk or olive oil release the eugenol into the fat medium, where it becomes available for absorption through the intestinal wall, at rates studies suggest may be several times higher than dry consumption. The medieval merchants were not grinding cloves into beverages, but they were handling the oil-rich powder with bare hands, pressing it between their fingers, inhaling the volatile compounds at close range. Their exposure was almost certainly more bioavailable than most modern herbal capsules standardized to a fraction of the whole compound. The Book of Proverbs says, "Gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones." The Hebrew word translated healing here is marpe, and in the wider Hebrew scriptural context, this word connects physical restoration to the compounds of the natural world with a directness that the English translations soften considerably. Proverbs 17:22 uses the same root for the merry heart that acts as medicine. The ancient writers were not making a metaphor. They were describing a category of experience, the thing that heals from the inside, reaching into tissue and bone. That is precisely what the fat-soluble bioavailability of eugenol now explains in molecular terms. Now for cinnamon. Cinnamomum verum, true cinnamon, grown in Sri Lanka and carried by Arab traders who, for centuries, kept its origin a carefully guarded commercial secret. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder knew that cinnamon came from somewhere in the East and complained bitterly about the markup. He could not have known that the compound he was overpaying for, trans-cinnamaldehyde, would eventually be studied by researchers at Kansas State University and found to demonstrate activity against E. coli 0157:H7 and Salmonella typhimurium, two of the foodborne pathogens responsible for most serious gastrointestinal illness in the modern world. Trans-cinnamaldehyde works through a mechanism that has attracted particular research attention. It targets the bacterial enzyme histidine kinase, which is central to the two-component regulatory systems bacteria use to sense and respond to environmental threats. Disrupt that regulatory system, and the bacterium cannot adapt. It cannot mount a resistance response. Several researchers have described this mechanism with language suggesting it may be one reason why cinnamaldehyde is harder for bacteria to build resistance against compared to many conventional antibiotics. But here is where the story deepens and connects to something most cinnamon discussions never reach. There are two kinds of cinnamon available in most American grocery stores, and most people cannot tell them apart by looking. Ceylon cinnamon, true cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, has a delicate, sweet, layered flavor and pale tan color. Cassia cinnamon, Cinnamomum cassia, sometimes called Chinese cinnamon, is darker, stronger, and contains significantly higher levels of coumarin, a compound that at high doses has hepatotoxic effects in sensitive individuals. The German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment conducted analysis showing that the coumarin levels in cassia cinnamon can reach concentrations at regular high-dose consumption that approach cautionary thresholds for people with existing liver concerns. Ceylon cinnamon contains coumarin at levels several orders of magnitude lower. The practical instruction is simple. If you are using cinnamon therapeutically, more than a casual sprinkle on oatmeal, purchase Ceylon cinnamon specifically. The label will say it. The sticks, if you see them, will be soft, layered, papery rolls, rather than the single dense quill of cassia. 1/4 teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon stirred into warm fat, morning or evening, provides a meaningful dose of trans-cinnamaldehyde in an absorption-optimized form. Now stop here, because this is the story the script has been moving toward. In the year 980, in the city of Hamadan in what is now western Iran, a 10-year-old boy named Ibn Sina, whom the Latin West would later call Avicenna, was already studying medicine under the physician Kushyar. By the age of 16, he was seeing patients alone. By the age of 21, he had completed the first draft of what would become the Canon of Medicine, a text that would be the primary medical reference at European universities for 600 years. In his clinic in Hamadan, Avicenna treated a wealthy merchant who had developed what the records describe as a deep, festering wound in his lower leg. A wound that had been opened and closed 3 times without healing, that stank, that had begun darkening the tissue around its edges. The merchant had seen other physicians. Nothing had worked. Avicenna noted in his records, with the careful precision of a man who understood that his observations might outlive him, that the wound contained evidence of what he called putrid corruption. Rotting tissue resistant to the body's own attempts at repair. His prescription was this: a compound preparation applied directly to the wound, consisting of olive oil infused for 7 days with dried clove, powdered cinnamon bark, rosemary leaves pressed fresh, and dried thyme. Applied on a clean cloth, held in place, changed twice daily. The wound, his record states, began to close. That is not symbolism. In modern terms, specifically in what microbiology and wound care research now understands about anaerobic infection and biofilm formation, that is a precise clinical description of exactly what that wound environment needed. The tissue that was darkening and resistant was almost certainly hosting a population of anaerobic bacteria organized inside a protective biofilm, the same mechanism by which chronic, non-healing wounds resist modern antibiotics today. The eugenol from the cloves, being fat-soluble, would penetrate the olive oil carrier and distribute through the wound bed. The trans-cinnamaldehyde would disrupt the quorum-sensing mechanisms the bacteria were using to coordinate their biofilm structure. The rosmarinic acid from the rosemary, which we will reach in a moment, would suppress the inflammatory cascade that was preventing new tissue formation. And the thymol from the thyme, the most potent antiseptic of the four, would attack the exposed bacterial membranes directly. Avicenna was not guessing. He had the canon of medicine, which itself compiled 500 years of Persian, Greek, and Indian clinical observation. He had a systematic pharmacopoeia of preparations, tested across generations of careful observers who wrote down what happened. He had, in the language of modern evidence-based medicine, a substantial observational data set. The wound closed, and Ibn Sina, who was 10 years old when he began studying this tradition, would go on to describe this compound preparation and its rationale in language that a contemporary wound care specialist, reading it today, would recognize as not merely plausible, but chemically coherent. Both science and faith were pointing at the same thing. The physician of Hamadan trusted the knowledge that had been passed to him. The molecules did what they had always done. The wound closed. Now, rosemary. Salvia rosmarinus. Reclassified in 2017 from Rosmarinus officinalis after genetic analysis confirmed it belongs with the sages. This reclassification distressed some herbalists and pleased nobody in particular, but the compounds did not change. Rosemary contains rosmarinic acid, the same compound found in self-heal and lemon balm. It also contains carnosic acid and carnosol, two diterpene compounds that have been examined specifically for their activity against bacterial biofilms and for their capacity to inhibit 5-lipoxygenase, the enzyme pathway central to pro-inflammatory prostaglandin synthesis. The Benedictine monasteries of medieval Europe cultivated rosemary at the center of their physic gardens. The herb was described in 9th century Carolingian capitularies, agricultural regulations issued under Charlemagne, as among the plants to be maintained at every royal estate for both food and medicine. Greek scholars draped it over their heads while studying, believing it sharpened memory and protected the brain. The Spanish brought it to the Americas. The Egyptians buried it with their dead, not merely as symbol, but because they understood it resisted decay, which is what antimicrobial function looks like without a microscope. What most sources quietly omit about rosemary is this. Carnosic acid, its most powerful antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory compound, is highly unstable. It oxidizes rapidly in dried rosemary powder. The dried rosemary sitting in most spice jars has lost a significant fraction of its carnosic acid content, particularly if it has been sitting for more than 6 months, or stored near heat, or packaged in clear glass rather than opaque containers that protect against ultraviolet degradation. Fresh rosemary, or rosemary infused into olive oil within days of harvest, preserves carnosic acid at levels meaningfully higher than powder. The oil preparation Avicenna described was not culinary preference. It was the correct extraction method for the most active compound. Infuse fresh rosemary sprigs in warm olive oil, no more than 60 degrees Celsius, for 4 hours. Strain and store in a dark glass bottle. This is medicine that was prepared in this way for 1,000 years. The chemistry now explains why. And finally, thyme. Thymus vulgaris. The most chemically aggressive antimicrobial on this entire list. The primary active compound is thymol, a phenolic monoterpene that constitutes between 20 and 55% of thyme essential oil depending on the chemotype and growing conditions. Thymol works at the bacterial cell membrane through a mechanism that research describes as catastrophic membrane disruption. It inserts into the phospholipid bilayer, increases permeability, and at sufficient concentrations, causes what researchers term total loss of membrane function. It has demonstrated activity against MRSA, against Candida albicans, against Helicobacter pylori, and against several drug-resistant gram-negative strains in laboratory settings. The Sumerians recorded thyme in their medical tablets. Ancient Egyptians used thyme oil in their embalming preparations, which, understood now, is a practical application of its antimicrobial and antifungal properties. Greek soldiers burned thyme before battle as an act of courage invocation. The word thyme comes from the Greek thymos, meaning spirit or soul. But the soldiers burning it were also inhaling thymol vapors, coating their airways with one of the most potent natural antiseptics in the botanical world. The ritual and the medicine were the same act. Here is the preparation detail that most thyme discussions miss entirely. Thymol concentration in thyme varies significantly with the growing conditions. Thyme grown in poor, dry, rocky, alkaline soil, the soil conditions of the Mediterranean hillsides where it evolved, produces dramatically higher thymol concentrations than thyme grown in rich, well-watered garden beds. This is the same mechanism that makes wild-grown herbs almost universally more medicinally potent than cultivated versions. Stress chemistry. The plant produces protective compounds in proportion to the threats it faces. Well-tended thyme is mild and pleasant. Thyme that has had to fight for its survival is something else entirely. If you grow thyme in your own garden, plant it in the driest, sunniest, most neglected corner you have. Forget it is there. Water it only when it looks genuinely distressed. The thyme that emerges from those conditions will bear no resemblance, medicinally, to the soft-leafed version sold in supermarket herb packets. Prepare thyme as a simple, covered infusion. 2 teaspoons of fresh or dried leaves in a cup of water just off the boil, covered tightly for 10 minutes to prevent the volatile thymol compounds from escaping with the steam. This detail matters. An uncovered thyme infusion loses a substantial fraction of its active compounds to evaporation before you drink it. The covering is not optional. Medieval apothecaries knew this. The steam you trap is the medicine. Now, the principle that connects all 4 of these, stated clearly. These 4 spices do not work through a single compound targeted at a single bacterial mechanism. They work through compound complexity. Multiple active agents operating simultaneously through different mechanisms, several of which are not easily circumvented by bacterial resistance pathways because they attack multiple targets at once. Eugenol at the membrane. Transinnamaldehyde at the regulatory system. Rosmarinic and carnosic acid at the inflammatory environment that bacteria exploit. Thymol at the structural integrity of the cell itself. The spice merchants of 1347 were bathed daily in a combination that disrupted bacterial function through 4 distinct pathways simultaneously. What industrial processing destroyed when we standardized these compounds into capsules and extracts and isolated fractions was precisely this interaction. A standardized eugenol extract performs meaningfully less well in research than whole clove preparations. The isolated compound loses the concert. The concert is the medicine. The ancient world did not have biochemistry. It had something that preceded biochemistry by thousands of years: accumulated clinical observation. Generation after generation of people watching what happened to other people, recording it, transmitting it, testing it across populations, refining it across centuries. In the language of modern evidence, that is a very large data set. The sample sizes were not controlled. The confounders were abundant. But the signal was strong enough to survive every generation's skepticism, to be independently rediscovered by civilizations with no contact with each other, to persist through conquest and collapse and plague and industrialization, and to arrive, stubbornly, here. There is a question that I find myself returning to after years of reading both the clinical literature and the historical record, and I will leave you with it. We now know enough biochemistry to understand why Avicenna's wound preparation worked. We know the compounds, the mechanisms, the pathways. What we do not fully know is how much else, sitting in historical medical records, in monastic gardens, in the kitchen knowledge of grandmothers in Hamadan and Thrace and Galway, represents medicine that has not yet been submitted to the kind of examination that would finally explain it. How many times across the last century of pharmaceutical development did we test a traditional remedy, find it ineffective, and conclude it was folklore, not knowing that we extracted it wrong, or stored it wrong, or separated it from the compound it required to function? The plants have not forgotten what they were. The knowledge of how to work with them is more fragile than the plants themselves. That question is worth carrying with you. If this kind of conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which one surprised you most. I read every single one. New content every week. We are just getting started.